Please ignore all of the background noise. Yeah, I know, it's kind of awful. See, what the fuck is that? So you might be wondering how I ended up here. I did not set out to create a Matrix costume. What I set out to do was to create a kind of 2020 meets 1910 jacket made with a modern suiting fabric, but with the shaping of a 1910s American / kind of Western European jacket. So I started out by drafting a pattern using a diagram from this book, which it was alright. Maybe not my favorite drafting experience I've ever had, but it came out okay. After drafting this pattern, I created a mock-up out of this cotton poly blend. In the mock-up, I saw that I needed to take in some room around the sides and the waist a little bit, but I wanted to keep it not skin tight because I want this to fit more as a modern jacket rather than like a period accurate kind of, well, 1910 I feel like you're not quite getting skin tight anymore, but like if you go maybe 10 years earlier or even 5 years earlier, jackets were pretty fitted. But I wanted to go for something that I could wear over like a modern turtleneck and not be, you know, feel like a sausage wrapped up way too tight. Then I moved on to my final fabric, and to choose this fabric, I went in my stash and I picked my least favorite wool because I wanted to do some new things with this project and I wanted to pick something that I would not feel terrible about messing up. So this black and white herringbone I got thinking that it would look nice, which it does up close, but when you zoom out a little bit, it looks kind of metallic, which I don't love, but that contributes to the end effect of it looking like a Matrix costume. So it kind of worked out. I used tailor's tacks to mark the edges of my pieces, which if you're curious about, I have a video on that, which I will link over here. So then I basted together the body of the jacket on the shoulder seams and all of the vertical seams to check the fit once more because, you know, the mock-up fabric I was working with definitely didn't have all of the same draping qualities that the final fabric does, so I wanted to do a little bit more fitting. And here you can see it looks all right. I ended up taking in a little bit more room in the waist. I also drafted a sleeve pattern and a collar pattern. Then I created a mock-up for my sleeve out of this cotton poly blend. This is a recycled fabric from an old bed sheet, and I ended up using it as a sleeve lining, which I'll be honest, was not the best idea. It has a little bit too much friction and a little bit too much structure for a sleeve lining. So yeah, don't particularly recommend that, but it's what I did. Here you can see I basted the sleeve onto the body and the pitch was way off. Here I rebasted on my sleeve mock-up with a much better sleeve pitch. Still not perfect, but anyways, I was like, okay, that's enough information. Good enough. We're gonna take it off and start to work on the tailoring. So for my collar, which I was a little bit overly excited and did this in a maybe questionable order, but it really didn't matter that much. So I started to create a collar. I cut out my under collar out of this thick wool fabric. The reason that I went with this fabric rather than going with the thinner suiting weight herringbone is that this fabric will give me more body and more structure and be nicer to work with. And because of the slightly looser weave, it'll allow me to put more shape into the undercollar. I traced it out and traced out my roll line, and then I also cut out a piece of chest canvas because I like to use chest canvas for my collars. Some people will call this soft tailoring. Personally, I find that a relatively stiff chest canvas is enough structure for my collars. I basted them together and then I went ahead and started pad stitching and shaping my collar. I'm thinking about doing a in-depth step-by-step tutorial for tailoring collars. If you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments down below. I trimmed down the canvas and did some pressing and shaping of the collar with my iron to help it fit around my neck. Going back to the rest of the jacket, I sewed all of the vertical seams on my vintage sewing machine and pressed them open. For the darts in the front, I pressed the seam allowance towards the center front, and for the back, I pressed the seam allowances towards the center back. Here's a clip of me showing you the difference between the pressed seam and the unpressed seam. The center back seam I pressed open. So then I went ahead and cut out a chest canvas. I'm using a fairly lightweight chest canvas, and I just kind of traced out my front section going just below the dart point of the bust and bringing it down a little bit past the waist in the front. I didn't feel like bringing the canvas all the way down to the hem just because, I don't know, it seemed like a lot of work and I just didn't feel like doing it. So I didn't. I also cut out another piece of the stiffer chest canvas that I used for the collar for the top part of the chest, and also a piece of this felt fabric that's used to add a little bit of body and a little bit of smoothness to your tailoring projects. So then I basted my canvas layers together and pad stitched them together, and then I basted the chest canvases into the outer fabric and began pad stitching the lapels. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial on this whole process, I'm also thinking about doing one of those. After pad stitching the lapel, I trimmed down the canvas and added the tailor's tape to the roll line under a little bit of tension, and also added tailor's tape around the entire front edge, extending past the bottom of the canvas all the way to the hem of the jacket. Then I sewed the facing pieces to the front pieces just outside the edge of the tailor's tape. I decided to try doing this by machine rather than by hand with a tiny slip stitch from the outside, and to try a different method of making sure that only the edge of the fabric that I want shows. So I did the couture tailoring equivalent of edge stitching. If you're familiar with edge stitching, you know that you bring all the seam allowances towards the lining side and just sew by machine next to that, and that kind of gives you this extra bulk on the lining side that then the outer fabric side has to kind of come around to cover that bulk that you've created with the seam allowances, and it means that you get a really nice smooth edge and you don't have any of the lining poking out. So the way that you do that by hand, as you can see right here, I'm bringing the seam allowance, and actually only one of the seam allowance edges, towards the side which is going to be on the inside, so that switches. On the lapel, it's towards the outer fabric, but then once you get below the lapel, it's the facing side. You take that seam allowance and just stitch it down with an invisible stitch and a little bit of tension towards the lining side. I trimmed the lapel corner and I pressed my lapels to make sure everything is laying nice and flat, but I didn't press a crease into the roll of the lapel because I wanted to leave that really nice and soft. I basted this edge to make sure that everything stays in place while I continue working on the rest of the garment. So then I cut out my sleeves out of the outer fabric and also lining for the main body out of a lining fabric. And yeah, this is kind of out of order, don't judge me. For some reason I needed to rethread my machine at this point, so I did that and sewed the lining together. Then I basted my lining into the main body of the garment and turned the edges under and pressed them and basted those in place. Then I sewed the lining in with a pick stitch along the front edges. Oh, I forgot. I actually didn't sew the side seams on anything yet. If you're wondering what's happening, I'm looking at the footage on my computer right now to remember exactly what I did, and I kind of forgot that. But so the side seams were never sewn other than basting, and the basting was taken out. So when I put the lining in, I was putting it into each side separately. Now I remember. So I basted the lining into the back, down the center back, and then I sewed the side seams in the outer fabric by machine, not catching the lining at all, and sewed the lining by hand along the side seam. And yes, of course, I did baste it first. Moving on to the hem of the jacket, I trimmed it to be even and then folded it up and pressed it, basted it, and sewed it to itself. So the outer fabric to itself with a cross stitch or a catch stitch. Then I trimmed the lining down to meet the edge of the outer fabric and folded it up and pressed it and basted the lining into place about an inch or so above the bottom edge of the lining, and then I folded that edge up and did a catch stitch between the folded up edge of the outer fabric and the edge of the lining. By having the outer fabric attached to itself rather than just attached to the lining, it means that that hem is going to stay in place, and where the hem sits isn't dependent on how the lining is falling. To sew the shoulder seams, I basted the outer layer and canvas together without the lining and sewed that by machine, and then pressed it and finished the lining by hand, first basting it and pressing it and then sewing it. Now that the shoulder seam is sewn, I can move on to the collars. So I trimmed down not only the canvas but also the outer fabric of the under collar. I haven't done this exact method of collars before, mostly because I haven't had a collar felt fabric, which would be a wool felt. It has to be natural fiber because of the amount of pressing and shaping you need to do. We just couldn't do it with a synthetic fiber. But the reason for having it be like a felt or a fabric that doesn't fray is because it needs to not fray. And this fabric frays a little bit, so I had to do some sort of extra things to make sure that that was gonna be okay. I basted it onto the neckline. Then I got my outer collar piece, which is the outer fabric, and I attempted to give it a little bit of shape with pressing. Because this fabric is a lighter weight suiting fabric, and it is, you know, lighter weight suiting fabrics tend to be a little bit more tightly woven and a little bit harder to press shape into. I did my best to give it the shape that would allow it to sit on top of my pad stitch undercollar, but I know sometimes people cut these in two separate pieces with fabrics that aren't going to shape very much. So I maybe should have done that with this fabric, but it worked out all right. It was a bit of a struggle to get any shape into this fabric though. I basted the over collar fabric along the roll line first and then on either side. So then to actually attach the collar to the body, I catch stitched the seam allowance of the body on the neckline to the inside of the under collar. I did a really tiny overlapped catch stitch on this edge of the under collar to attach it to the outer fabric and also to finish off that edge. So the catch stitch here is small enough and tight enough that it essentially becomes an overcasting stitch at the same time. And of course, you really can't see any of that because I'm using black thread on black fabric and it's very hard to pick up on camera. So then I trimmed down my over collar fabric to have only about 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance around the top and bottom edges. I had to clip into the bottom edge a little bit. This is where I wish I had done a separate collar stand and fall, is what it is, and I ended up getting all of those edges finished cleanly. In the end, I folded the edges under and basted and pressed them and finished it again with a catch stitch. I also just folded under the outer collar around the gorge line. Is it called the gorge line? I look at the pictures in books, okay? Vocab is not my strong suit. The part right here where you see the lapel meet the collar, I folded that under, basted it, and sewed it by hand from the outside with a really tiny, honestly, there are different names for this stitch. It's similar to a whip stitch or a felling stitch. It has to be tiny enough and tight enough that it basically is the equivalent of having sewn those two pieces of fabric right side together by machine, except you do it from the outside by hand. I will say here, I made a mistake and the lapel fabric, the seam allowance should have been pressed down because if you look now, there is a little bit of a shadow because all of the seam allowances and all of the fabric are going up into the collar, so you get just a little bit more bulk there and it gives a slight shadow under the seam line, even though I did it by hand, which actually should mitigate the shadow a little bit because it's a softer seam than a machine sewn seam. But anyways, that is a mistake that only a trained tailor would probably recognize looking at this jacket. I mean, now all of you will because I told you. There are a lot of mistakes in this project, and at this point, this is about when I started to give up. Which I didn't fully give up, and you'll see, but moving on to the sleeves, I knew I wanted to do a little bit more of a structured sleeve than I have in the past, which is part of why I chose a fabric that I didn't like to do this project. I didn't go out and buy it, it was in my stash. I also decided not to do really anything with the cuff besides hem it. So there's no opening, there's no buttons, there's no buttonholes, nothing, just the sleeve ends. So then I pressed the inside curve of the sleeves a little bit to try to stretch it out. Probably should have done that more, but I just did it a little bit, and I sewed those vertical seams on both the outer fabric and the lining fabric. Then I laid them together and I sewed the seam allowances together by hand. I did use a basting stitch and basting thread, but I sewed them enough that it should stay. Oh, then I went back to the main body, again, chaotic order, and finished the lining, which just got folded under and basted at the back neck, and also finished the ends of the collars. So to do that, the collar, there's one collar. There's two ends though. So the edges are already folded under of the the gray herringbone, but I folded the edges under and folded it around to the under collar side, and the edges, these two edges, if that makes sense, get pick stitched, and then this edge, which is a raw edge, as you can see, gets, wow, the traffic again, gets catch stitched to finish off that edge while attaching it. So to hem my sleeves, which I'm honestly not sure if I have any footage of this, but what I did was fold the outer fabric under, and I made the mistake here of not fitting the length of my sleeves and not cutting them properly so that they taper at the end, which means that I can't get a really nice clean hem because the end is smaller than the part I need to attach it to hem. So it's messy, it looks bad. You know, if you weren't paying attention, you probably wouldn't notice it if you just saw me walking, but if you look at it, it looks bad. I will say that, but I pressed it under and did basically the same hem as on the bottom. First, I catch stitched the outer fabric to itself to anchor it, trimmed the lining, folded the lining under, and basted it in place. Pushed it up and catch stitched the lining to the folded up edge of the outer fabric. For the sleeve, which I am currently very quickly giving up on, I cut some strips of muslin fabric on the cross grain. It's probably, I don't know. This was probably not the right fabric choice for this. I think it was honestly a little bit thick. And you're supposed to use more of a pocketing. I cut some cross grain strips and I pressed a bit of a curve into it and basted that into the arm side of the main body to give it a little bit more structure. I sewed the sleeve in with the back stitch and then brought the lining up and basted it in place and sewed it in with a felling stitch to the lining of the main body. And yeah, that was basically it. I think the only other thing I did was to add a hook and eye to the front, which I think my original sketch for this actually didn't really include a button, so followed my original sketch, I guess. But mostly I just didn't feel like doing a button and a buttonhole, and I liked the kind of clean look. Which I feel like kind of goes with the whole Matrix thing that just happened at the end. I also pick stitched the entire front edge from the bottom all the way up, around the collar and lapel, and back down. It took me until I actually turned on the camera to shoot the reveal and took the first video clip to realize that I look like I came out of a Matrix movie. So, there you go. Enjoy. Side note, if you're interested in the blouse I'm wearing, the pattern is available on my Ko-fi page, which will be linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Again, comment if you want to see those more in-depth tailoring tutorial style videos, if that's something you'd be interested in, or if you would just find those incredibly boring and I should not do them. I would love to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!